I don't do charity galas. I don't do networking events, industry mixers, or any kind of room where people stand around holding wine glasses and trying to look like they belong there. My name is Reed Calloway. I'm 32 years old and I run an HVAC crew out of Burlington, Ontario. We handle commercial systems, office towers, hotels, event venues. If your heating dies in February or your cooling goes down in the middle of a July heat wave, we're the ones who show up at 2 in the morning and fix it without making you feel bad about calling. That's what I do. That's all I've ever really wanted to do. So when my supervisor Kevin told me I had to show up to the Lakeside Meridian's annual industry gala, I pushed back hard. I told him I had a unit to inspect the next morning. He said reschedule it. I told him I didn't own anything appropriate to wear. He said wear what you've got. I told him I was bad at small talk. He didn't even bother answering that one. He just said the new building group that took over the Meridian wanted to meet their contractors in person and that we needed someone senior from the team to be there. Then he said Marcus Tilden was also going. That was the real reason he told me. Marcus Tilden had been with our company for 6 years. In that time he had never once fixed anything faster than I had, never once solved a problem I couldn't, but somehow he was always the one standing in the right room when someone needed to shake a hand or put a face to a company name. He talked the way people in those rooms expected to be talked to. Loud, confident, with just enough self-deprecation, sprinkled in to seem humble without actually being it. I didn't dislike him for being good at that. I disliked him because he wasn't good at much else, and nobody seemed to notice. I drove to the gala in my own truck and parked 3 blocks away. The Lakeside Meridian Ballroom was the kind of space that had been designed to make you feel like you weren't good enough to be standing in it. Vaulted ceilings, exposed timber beams, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Lake Ontario. The lighting was warm and soft in the way that only very expensive lighting could be. Round tables with white linen, wine glasses catching the light, servers moving quietly between them. The event was supporting a resettlement fund for newcomers to the region. Families from across the country being helped to rebuild after displacement. That part I respected. The rest of it, the posturing, the name-dropping, the way half the room was looking at each other and calculating, that part I could have done without. I found a spot near one of the back pillars with a sightline to the door and stayed there. Then I saw her. She was sitting alone at a table near the center of the room, not off to the side the way you'd expect if someone was being intentionally quiet, right in the middle, surrounded by empty chairs. She was wearing a dark green dress, understated, the kind of thing that didn't try to compete with the room, dark hair pulled back loosely. She sat very still, both hands resting in her lap, spine straight, chin level, not looking down, not looking around nervously, just looking straight ahead at the middle distance, like she had been through worse. And this was just Tuesday. Nobody was sitting with her. Nobody was pulling out a chair, or stopping to say hello, or even making eye contact as they passed. A man in a gray suit walked by her table, leaned toward the woman beside him, and said something behind his hand. The woman he said it to glanced over, pressed her lips together, and looked away quickly. I heard a voice behind me, a woman talking to someone I couldn't see. Still showing up to these things, she said. Not quietly enough. After everything, you'd think she'd just let it go. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what everything meant. But I knew what that kind of isolation looked like, and I knew it wasn't accidental. You don't end up sitting alone in the center of a room by chance. You end up there because the people around you have decided that sitting next to you carries a cost they're not willing to pay. That was when Marcus found me. He was already on his second drink. I could tell by the way he was holding the glass. Loose, casual, and by the fact that his jacket was already unbuttoned even though we'd only been there 40 minutes. He came over with 2 of the junior contractors from a company we occasionally partnered with on bigger jobs. All 3 of them wearing the same expression, the slightly lit look of people who were enjoying being somewhere fancy on someone else's tab. "Reed," Marcus said, loud enough to carry. "There he is. Tell me you haven't just been standing here all night." "I've been standing here all night," I said. He laughed like that was the funniest thing he'd heard. Then he turned and looked toward the woman at the center table. He turned back with that smile already forming. "You know what? I just figured out your evening," he said. "Right there. That's your table." The 2 guys beside him picked up on where this was going and started grinning. "That's Vera Ashworth," Marcus said, his voice dropping into the register people use when they want to sound like they're sharing important information. Used to run Ashworth Capital up in Toronto. High-end real estate development, big projects all across the GTA. Then everything came apart. Bad partners, some kind of SEC-adjacent investigation north of the border, the whole thing collapsed. Family lost the portfolio. Father had a breakdown. She had to sell the condo, the car, everything. He paused for effect. Now she's apparently doing consulting. Whatever that means when you've got nothing left to consult from. One of the other guys laughed softly. Not loud, just enough. Marcus kept going. You two would actually be perfect. You fix broken systems for a living and she is. He gestured vaguely in her direction. Well, you see it. More laughter, still quiet. The kind that's designed to cut without drawing attention to itself. Looked across the room at her. Vera Ashworth hadn't moved. Her hands were still in her lap. But I watched her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the way someone does when they've heard exactly what was said and have decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. She had heard every word. I was certain of it. The table was not that far away. The room was not that loud. And she just sat there, still, absorbing it. Something shifted in my chest. Not outrage, not exactly. More like a recognition. I knew what it felt like to be the person in the room that everyone had already decided wasn't worth the effort. I'd spent most of my 20s being that person in every setting that wasn't a job site. And I had never once had someone walk across a room because of it. I set my glass down on the pillar behind me. You're done with that, I said to Marcus. He blinked. What? The bit? You're done. He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't recognize. The two guys beside him went quiet. I didn't wait for a response. I walked across the ballroom. My footsteps felt loud. The floor was polished concrete under carpet, and every step had a weight to it I was aware of. When I reached her table, I didn't pull out the chair across from her. I pulled out the one directly beside her, moved it a little closer than was probably conventional, and sat down. I turned toward the bar where Marcus was still standing, watching, and I looked at him steadily. If it's funny, I said, my voice even, say it at a normal volume. Don't whisper it across a room and pretend that makes it something else. The smile dropped off his face. Whispering doesn't clean it up, I said. It just tells everyone you already know it's ugly. The surrounding area went quiet in that particular way where people stop moving and start listening while pretending not to. I held Marcus's gaze for another second, then I turned back toward the table. Vera Ashworth was looking at me. Not startled, not tearful. Just looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, steady, measuring, with something underneath it that was either relief or disbelief or some combination of the two. Like she hadn't been sure someone was going to do that. Like she had already prepared herself for the version of the night where nobody did. I nodded once, more to acknowledge that I'd sat down than for any other reason. She nodded back. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room started breathing again around us. I could hear the low current of conversation resuming, glasses clinking, someone laughing too loudly 2 tables over. Marcus and his group had turned back to the bar, probably regrouping. Men like that always regroup. I didn't need that, Vera said quietly. I know, I said. I didn't do it because you needed it. She looked at me. Why did you? Because I didn't want to be another person who saw it, and looked away. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Reed Calloway. You're with Calloway HVAC. I looked at her. How do you know that? Your company tag on your belt clip, she said. Also, your company serviced this building last winter. I read the contractor reports before I came tonight. That caught me off enough that I didn't answer right away. Why would you read contractor reports for a gala? I asked. She looked at the room. Habit, she said. I read everything before I walk into a room. Old instinct. We sat without talking for a little while after that. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was the kind of silence between people who don't know each other well enough for conversation yet, but aren't bothered by that fact. I picked up the event program that had been left at my place and looked at it without reading it. The chicken is going to be dry, I said finally. Vera glanced at the program. It's always dry at these things. They do it in bulk, a beat. The roasted vegetables are usually fine. That's something. It is. She looked at her water glass. There was a quality to her stillness that wasn't discomfort. It was more like someone who had learned a long time ago not to take up more space than they were going to be allowed anyway. You used to run Ashworth Capital, I said. Not a question. I did, she said. What happened? She looked at me sideways. Most people didn't ask directly. Most people danced around it, or didn't bring it up at all, which was its own kind of insult. She seemed to register that I'd just asked a straight question, and decided to answer it the same way. My father's partners, she said. He built Ashworth over 25 years. I came in on the development side when I was 26. We had projects in Toronto, Ottawa, too, and Calgary. Good work, sound investments. She paused. His senior partners had been running a parallel structure for years, moving capital between holding companies, inflating property valuations on paper, filing misleading reports to investors. By the time the regulators started looking, it was already entangled. My father's name was on enough documents that it took 2 years and most of our remaining capital to establish that he hadn't known. The partners took deals. We got left with the legal fees and the reputation damage. I let that sit for a moment. And the city decided it was easier to assume the worst, I said. Cities always do, she said. It's faster, and people like a clear story. Fallen Family is a clean story. It doesn't require nuance. How long ago? 4 years. She said it the way you say something you've made peace with but still carry. My father had a heart event 18 months after it started. He recovered, but he's not the same. He doesn't come to things like this anymore. Does he know you still do? Something shifted in her expression. He worries about it, she said. But I told him I wasn't going to stop showing up. If I disappear from every room where people remember what happened, then the story they tell about us becomes the only story. And I'm not willing to give them that. Those words settled in my chest in a way I didn't expect. We talked more after that. Not about the past, or not only about it. She asked me how long I'd been running commercial HVAC, and I told her 8 years since I went independent, 2 years before that working for someone else. She asked what the worst job I'd ever had was, and I told her about a geothermal system in a resort outside Collingwood that had been installed by someone who'd watched a YouTube video and taken some very creative liberties with the piping. She actually smiled at that, not a polite smile. A real one, small and quick, like it had slipped out before she could decide whether to let it. She told me she'd been doing independent advisory work for smaller real estate groups, mostly developers in the mid-range market, who needed someone who knew the landscape but couldn't afford the Bay Street firms. She said it paid less than anything she'd done before and required more persuasion to be taken seriously. She said she didn't mind the persuasion as much as she'd expected to. I believed her. I don't know how much time had passed when I heard footsteps coming toward us. I didn't have to look up to know it was Marcus. There are certain kinds of footsteps that carry their own warning. Not heavy, just deliberate. The walk of someone who's decided to make a point. He stopped a few feet from the table. He had a fresh drink. His tie was looser. Neither of those things was a good sign. Sorry to interrupt, he said, not sounding sorry. Just wanted to check in, see how the evening's going. He looked at Vera with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. You know, I'll be honest, you're handling this well. Considering. Considering what? I said. He looked at me like I'd asked a boring question. Come on. The whole room knows the Ashworth situation. She shows up to these things, people are going to talk. That's just how it works. That's not how it works, I said. She ignored me. He turned back to Vera. No hard feelings about earlier. I was just saying what everyone here is already thinking. Vera looked at him. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't moved. Her hands were flat and still on the table. I stood up. I didn't make it a production. I just stood. You're not saying what everyone is thinking, I told him, my voice steady. You're saying what makes you feel bigger. Those aren't the same thing. His jaw moved. Raid. I'm going to say this once, I said. Not for your benefit. Because there are people at the 3 nearest tables who are pretending not to listen, and I want them to hear this clearly. I kept my voice even. She came to this event for the same reason anyone else did. She has as much right to be in this room as you do. Probably more, given what she's actually contributed to the industry. And the next time you feel the need to manage someone else's reputation in public, I'd suggest spending that energy on your own. Because your install quality on the Henderson Center job last March was the most embarrassing work I've ever had to go back in and fix. The silence was immediate and total. Marcus's face went a particular shade of red I hadn't seen on a person before. A few people at nearby tables had stopped even pretending to look elsewhere. Marcus tried to laugh. It came out sounding like something with the air let out. You're serious right now. I'm always serious, I said. Ask anyone on any job site we've both been on. Word. He stood there for another few seconds, caught between doubling down and leaving. Then he turned and walked back toward the bar. Not fast, because that would have been too obvious, but he didn't look at anyone as he went. I sat back down. Vera was watching me with that same measuring look she'd had when I first sat down. But something in it had changed. The guardedness was still there, but it had thinned in places. The Henderson Center job, she said. He rerouted a condensate line in a way that was going to fail inside of 2 winters, I said. We caught it on a maintenance check. He knows I know. That was convenient. Moderately, I said. She almost laughed. I heard the beginning of it before she caught it. Not quite all the way there, but close enough to count. The rest of the evening moved differently after that. The room had rearranged itself in the subtle way rooms do when something has shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but people's chairs were angled differently. Conversations had moved on, and the cluster at the bar had thinned. Marcus left early. I watched him go without feeling anything in particular about it. 2 people came to our table over the course of the next hour. One was a woman from a development firm in Kitchener's who said she'd heard Vera was doing advisory work and wanted her card. The other was an older man, probably mid-60s, who sat down without asking and talked to Vera for 20 minutes about a heritage property project in Hamilton that had been stalled for 3 years waiting for someone who understood the regulatory landscape. Vera talked to him with the kind of precise, unrattled fluency that comes from genuinely knowing something. Not performing knowledge, actually having it. I mostly listened. I'm good at that. When the older man finally left, Vera turned back to me. That was the first real conversation I've had at one of these in 2 years, she said. The Kitchener woman or the Hamilton guy? Both, she said. Either. I didn't say anything to that. Why did you really sit down, she asked, not challenging. Just asking again, differently than the first time. I thought about it. Because the way you were sitting, I said finally, looked like someone who had already accepted the night was going to be a certain way, and I didn't think that was fair. She looked at me for a long moment. That's a very specific thing to notice, she said. I notice specific things, I said. It's part of the job. The gala ended around 10. Most of the room cleared quickly the way these events do once the official portion wraps up. Coats appearing from nowhere. Goodbyes that run longer than they need to. People suddenly very interested in checking their phones. I walked Vera to the lobby, not because she needed me to, just because it felt like the right thing to do, and I had stopped second-guessing what felt right a long time ago. At the entrance, she turned and held out her hand. Reed Calloway, she said. I shook it. Vera Ashworth. Thank you, she said. Not for defending me, for sitting down. There's a difference. Yes, she said. Defending me was about the room. Sitting down was about me. I didn't have a good answer for that. So I just nodded, and she walked out into the night toward the valet line, and I stood in the lobby for a moment longer than I needed to before heading back to my truck. I thought that would be the whole story. One strange evening, one right call, the kind of thing you file away and don't think about too often. I went back to my regular life, job sites, scheduling, one very complicated rooftop unit on a commercial building in Oakville that took 2 weeks longer than it should have because someone had buried the original ductwork under a layer of insulation that wasn't on any of the blueprints we'd been given. 6 weeks later, my phone rang from a Toronto area code I didn't recognize. It was Vera. She said she was working with a housing group, a nonprofit consortium, pulling together funding and development capacity to convert decommissioned commercial properties into transitional housing for newcomer families across Hamilton and the Western GTA. They had the capital structure in place, they had municipal support, but they needed someone who could walk through a building and tell them honestly what it would take to bring it up to residential code. Not an estimate on paper, of Nules, a real assessment from someone who had actually been inside enough buildings to know where the problems hid. Why me? I asked. Because I watched you read that room in 30 seconds, she said. And then, act on what you read without waiting to see if it was convenient. I need someone who does that with buildings. I sat with it for a week. I talked to no one about it, which is how I make most decisions. Then I called her back and said yes. The next several months were the most complicated work I had done in years, and I had once replaced a full refrigeration system in a functioning restaurant kitchen without shutting the kitchen down, so the bar was not low. We moved through 12 properties across 4 municipalities. I spent days crawling through basements and mechanical rooms and attic spaces that hadn't been opened since the 90s, cataloging what was salvageable, what needed to be gutted, what was going to cost twice as much as anyone wanted to hear. Vera came to most of the site visits. She took notes by hand in a small black notebook and asked questions that were always more technical than people expected from someone in her role. Luke, we worked well together in the particular way that people do when they have different skills that happen to fit. She saw the regulatory and financial landscape. I saw what was in the walls. Between us, we could usually figure out whether a building was worth the fight. We talked a lot during those months. About the properties, at first. Then about other things. About what it had taken her to walk back into industry spaces after the collapse of Ashworth Capital, the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from having to prove yourself to people who had already made their decision. I told her about the years I spent convinced that someone like me, a guy with a trade certification and a pickup truck and no particular talent for the rooms where decisions get made, wasn't supposed to want more than that. That the ceiling was where it was for a reason, and pushing against it was just going to embarrass you. She told me that was the most wasteful thing she'd ever heard, and she said it the way she said most things, direct, unhurried, with a certainty that made it hard to argue back. One afternoon in late March, we handed the keys to the first completed property to a family from Ethiopia who had been living in temporary accommodation for 4 months. The father was in his early 40s. He had been an engineer back home. His wife had been a school administrator. Their daughter was 8 and had been doing her schoolwork on a tablet in a shelter common room since they arrived. When I put the key in his hand, he looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me, and then he pressed his hand over his heart and said something in Amharic that I didn't understand but didn't need to. I had to take a breath and look at the ceiling of the hallway to get myself together. Vera was standing a step behind me. When I turned around, her eyes were bright in the way that means someone is working very hard not to cry in front of people. "You okay?" I said quietly. "Yes," she said, in a voice that meant she was getting there. We walked out of the building into a cold afternoon that felt like spring was thinking about it. The street was ordinary, parked cars, a dog walker going past, the sound of a bus somewhere. All of it completely normal, all of it feeling like something else entirely. We stood on the front steps for a while without saying much. "I've been in a lot of rooms since everything fell apart," Vera said finally. Rooms where people were deciding whether I was worth their time. Rooms where I could feel what they thought of me without anyone having to say it. She looked at the door of the house. "This is the first room where none of that mattered at all." "Because of them," I said. "Because of them," she agreed. She paused. "And because of what it took to get here." I looked at her. The light was low and flat, the way it is in Ontario in late March when the sun hasn't quite remembered how to come back yet. She was looking at the house. I could see her profile, the particular set of her jaw that I had learned meant she was thinking something through carefully before she said it. "For what it's worth," I said, "the night of the gala, the reason I sat down." I stopped, found the right words. "It wasn't pity. I want to make sure you know that. I saw someone who was going to sit through something unfair without anyone pushing back, and I didn't want to be another person who watched that happen." She turned and looked at me. The measuring quality was still there, the one I'd first seen across that table at the Meridian. But the guardedness that had been underneath it was mostly gone now. "I know," she said. "I think I knew that night." "How?" "Because you didn't apologize to me before you sat down," she said. "People who feel pity always apologize first. You just sat down." I thought about that. "My mother would have called that having manners," I said. "Your mother sounds like she knew something," Vera said. We stood there a little while longer on that ordinary front step, with the ordinary street going past around us. Neither of us said anything else for a bit, and neither of us needed to. The house behind us had a working furnace, properly run electrical, solid flooring, and a roof that would hold through whatever the next few winters decided to throw at it. I knew this because I had been inside every wall of it. I had fixed what was broken, and I had left the rest the way it was, which is the first rule of the trade. You don't tear out what's sound just because it doesn't look new. That's always been my approach. With buildings, with people, with most things. I'm still working with Vera's consortium. We've got 3 more properties in progress and 2 more in assessment. My company picked up the maintenance contract for the Lakeside Meridian, which turned out to be larger than I expected and probably has something to do with the fact that Vera is on the building group's advisory committee, though she has never once mentioned it, and I have never once asked. Marcus left the company a few months after the gala. Quietly, the way those things go. I heard he picked up a position somewhere in Mississauga. I don't know any more than that, and I don't need to. Some nights I drive home from a site and think about how strange it is. That one decision to walk across a room, to pull a chair out and sit down next to someone because it was the right thing to do and not for any other reason, could have led to all of this. To the family from Ethiopia, and the properties, and the late evenings going over building assessments with a woman who asks better questions than anyone I've ever worked with. But then again, that's always been the thing about small choices. They rarely feel like much when you're making them. You're just doing what seems correct in the moment, because the alternative is something you don't want to be. I think about Vera standing on that front step in the March light, looking at the house we'd helped bring back. The way she'd said it, something that was once abandoned can still become something worth showing up for. She was talking about the house. I'm fairly sure she was also talking about something else. And when I pulled out of that street and drove home with the heater running and the radio off, I found I didn't mind the quiet at all. I've been turning that night over in my head for a long time now. Not obsessively, just the way you return to something when you're driving home and the radio's off and there's nothing else competing for the space. What I keep coming back to is how small the actual decision was. Pull out a chair, sit down, say something plainly and without raising your voice. That was it. I didn't plan any of it. I didn't walk across that ballroom with some speech prepared. I just looked at Vera Ashworth, sitting in the middle of a room full of people who had already decided she didn't belong there, and I thought, I don't want to be another person who watches this and does nothing. So I moved. And everything that came after, the consortium, the properties, the family from Ethiopia standing in their first real home, all of it traces back to that one unremarkable moment of deciding to act on what I knew was right. That's the part that still gets me. Not the scale of what followed, but the simplicity of where it started. I think about Marcus sometimes, not with any particular bitterness. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who had confused the ability to make people laugh at someone else with some kind of social currency worth spending. What he didn't understand, what I think a lot of people in rooms like that don't understand, is that how you treat someone you believe can't help you says more about your actual character than anything else you'll ever do in your life. There's no audience for those moments. Nobody's keeping score out loud. You either choose decency or you don't, and the record of that choice lives in you whether or not anyone else was watching. Vera had that figured out long before I met her. She'd walked back into a room that had written her off, not because she needed the validation, but because she refused to let the story end the way other people had decided it should. That takes something. Not stubbornness, exactly. Something quieter and harder to name. The kind of resolve that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only recognize once you've been watching someone from close up for long enough to understand what it actually costs them. What I know now that I didn't fully understand before that night is that most of the things worth doing in a life don't come with obvious entry points. You're never going to get a clear signal that this is the moment, that this choice is going to matter beyond today. You just have to have enough of a compass inside you to act correctly in the small, unremarkable moment and trust that the rest of it will find its shape. The tools for that aren't complicated. Knowing right from wrong and choosing right, even when it's inconvenient, that's the whole foundation. Being curious enough and honest enough to actually understand a situation before you react to it, instead of just going with whatever's easiest, that keeps you from making a fool of yourself and from hurting people carelessly. And being willing to stay in something difficult longer than feels comfortable, because the thing worth building usually takes more time than you initially thought. That's what separates the people who actually do something from the ones who just talk about it. I'm not sure I can claim I had all 3 working well that night, but I had enough, and it turns out enough is sometimes all it takes to start something that becomes much larger than you. The house in Hamilton had good bones. It just needed someone to walk through it slowly enough to see them. So did Vera. So I think did I.